knowing what he's doing with the weather. I was mentioned at some point here recently, I guess it might have been when I was preaching the other week, about the creativity of God and how he set the boundary of the ocean. He set the temperature and the position, the temperature of the sun and the position of the earth just to be perfect. And I don't know the actual numbers, but you know, if our earth, the globe, the planet that we live on was just a small percentage of a degree farther away from sun, we'd all freeze to death. If it was just a little bit closer, we'd probably all burn up. God and his creativity. I'm glad that we got a creative God. He's not only a creator, he's a creative God. And he said it just right, just for you and me. And so many things I could get into and take a lot of time this morning. We learned a word when I was in school, and in our elementary vocabulary test. You know, we had spelling and we had vocabulary test. And we had vocabulary words for the week, and one of those words one time was flabbergasted. We don't use that much. But when I look at the creativity of God and how it just all comes together, I am flabbergasted. I just stand in awe sometimes and wonder, and just baffled in my mind at how great our God is. I'm glad he's a good God and a great God. Maybe I should say it that way. Our lesson today is about an unusual lady. If you've looked at the lesson, you know that that's the case. How many of you know anything about Rizpah? Not but one hand. But most of us have read it. If we've read in our Bible, maybe it's a couple other hands, but if we read our Bible, we've run across this lady. And the book of 2 Samuel chapter 21. Now, I think it appears that our lesson writers in their dating of the lessons missed the target of Mother's Day by about 7 days. And that's okay. If I had a lot of Sundays I'm looking ahead. When I'm finished here, before I leave the church, I'll actually look ahead in my book, see what so I can get my thoughts headed in that direction, what the next Sunday's lesson is. And 2 Sundays ago, I didn't look ahead quite like I should have, and noticed 2 lessons ahead was a Mother's Day lessons. Otherwise, we'd have switched them, but that's okay. Qualities of true motherhood for today's lesson. And our golden text comes from Proverbs, "Thy father and thy mother shall be glad. She that bare thee shall rejoice." 2 Samuel chapter 21. Let's just read this text, and we'll talk for a few minutes about Rizpah. And maybe as the Lord leads, maybe get into some value of virtues and so on and so forth of the good mother and of a virtuous woman. 2 Samuel 21 and verse 8, "But the king took the sons of Rizpah, the sons of Aiah." Now, I know that's an odd word, but another spelling of that word is A-J-A-H. That's Aiah. It has to do with the Hebrew language. The J is a Y. Yahweh, Jehovah. And so we pronounce that as the daughter of Aiah, whom she bare unto Saul. Their names were Armani and Mephibosheth. This Mephibosheth is not to be confused with the other Mephibosheth that was lame on his feet. These are 2 different guys. These are the 2 sons of Rizpah, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Meholathite. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites. And they, the Gibeonites, hanged them in the hill before the Lord. And they fell all 7 together, and were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. And Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for her upon the rock from the beginning of harvest until the water dropped upon them out of heaven, and suffered neither the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beast of the field by night. And it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. And David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, his son, from the men of Jabesh Gilead, which had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them, when the Philistines had slain Saul in Gilboa. And he brought up from thence the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son, and they gathered the bones of them that were hanged. Now that should be also, but you get the picture there, all of their bones. And the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son buried they in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the sepulchre of Kish his father. And they performed all that the king commanded, and after that God was entreated for the land. Now there's some history here. We have to understand what had happened and where the reason why that the Gibeonites were upset with the children of Israel, or the nation of Israel at this time. If you go back to the book of Joshua, chapter 9, you'll find some history there. You remember how that Rahab told Joshua, said, we've heard of how God has moved for y'all, and said, we're afraid. And the children of Israel were a mighty force to be reckoned with. Why? Because God fought their battles. God gave them favor. And so that being the case, when the word came to their enemies who were in the path of their advance, those enemies sometimes would run to them and say, hey, we don't want no trouble here. You know, we know what God can do through you, and we don't want no trouble. So they'd make a treaty with them. Well, the Gibeonites had, the Bible said, wilily. In other words, subtly, sneaky, and deceitfully. They came back in the book of Joshua, chapter 9. You can read the story. Joshua and the children, God's people, children of Israel, were advancing, and the Gibeonites saw that they were in their path. And so they, if you remember, they put on old clothes, took moldy bread, worn out wineskins, and they pretended to be people from a far country. And they came to the children of Israel and begged allegiance with them. And so Joshua and the priest of the Lord, they swear by them that they would not hurt them. You can live here, you can be close to us, and we won't bother y'all. Well, it wasn't long till the plot was revealed, and Joshua, I think he kind of got upset about it because he chided them for it. He said, you told us that you came on a long journey. You dressed in old clothes, you brought moldy bread and bad wineskins, and you portrayed yourself as to be some foreigner coming from a long place and a long way off. And he said, all the while, y'all were living right here among us. Now, he justifiably could have went ahead and advanced upon them. But because the men of God had swore, he was going to keep their word. And so there was a covenant between them that the Israelites, or the nation of Israel, would never bother them. Well, here comes Saul, the first king of Israel. And he came, and he was in his zeal. Saul lost his anointing by, I like to say it like this, he lost his anointing by proceeding into the holy place of God. He lost his favor with God. And he lost his mind in his pursuit of David. But the sad part about it is, in a great and a broader perspective spiritually, he lost his way and he lost his soul. And his problem was he was jealous of David. Now could take a lot of turns in this story this morning. He was jealous of David, and so he sought to kill him. I mean, he pursued him like a vagabond, like a fugitive, for some said 13 years, some said 20 years, I don't know. But for over a decade, he pursued David, chased him down like a mad dog. And when it come to the Gibeonites, the Bible tells us, and it might mean these words, but basically Saul just come to them and he just run roughshod over them too. They didn't like it, but they couldn't do anything about it. So when the time come, David took the throne, Saul was dead, and all of a sudden there started being a famine in the land. If you'll read the previous verses of 2 Samuel chapter 21, you'll find that there was a famine in the land. That's what the Bible speaks about. It was a famine of no rain. The land was in drought, and the things were not looking good. And so David inquired at the Lord, and the Lord answered and said, "It is for Saul." This is why you're going through this, because Saul broke the word of my people. He said, "Saul, for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites." There's consequences to not keeping your word. I don't want to get sidetracked here on that, but that's what happened. And the king, David, called the Gibeonites, and he said, what can we do to fix this? He began to try to make some wrongs. It wasn't his fault. He didn't do anything about it. He said, let's try to fix this. Kind of reminds me of a situation a few years ago. Brother Mark and I were talking, just he and I mentioned a certain preacher, and he told me something, and that wasn't my fault, but I just felt the need. And I said, Brother Mark, you probably remember it. I said, Brother Mark, I'm sorry about that. And, of course, I didn't do anything wrong, but I just felt the need. I'm going to apologize for this brother. He may never. And so David, he didn't have to do that as far as the people were concerned, but he had to do it as far as God was concerned. And that's the most important thing this morning, is trying to keep the favor of God. And so David said, Lord, why is this happening? He said, Saul done this, David. And so he went to the men of Gibeah. He really probably should have just took the matter up with the Lord and let God settle it. But David went, and he wasn't wrong in what he'd done, but sometimes there's a better way to handle things. And so he offered up an opportunity for the Gibeonites to be entreated and to be appeased or pleased and to regain their favor. Now, he really should have sought the favor of God, but he was trying to do his best, and I kind of like some of the things we've done as pastors and as married folks, as raising children and other things. We look back and we thought, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And so that's kind of what David got into here. Seemed like a good idea at the time. So he goes to the Gibeonites and he said, what can we do to make this right? And they said, we don't want your gold and we don't want your silver. And David's thinking, well, really? Okay, what do you want? And really, his mind is probably thinking ahead, and he's thinking, well, they're just going to say, we just want an apology and we'll be fine. Let's move forward from here. But all of a sudden, the smile vanished from their face. They said, we don't want silver and we don't want gold. But then the smile vanished. And they said, we want the descendants of Saul's family, that we may punish them. And so the story comes up, and David says he's got himself between a rock and a hard place now. And so he says, okay, that's what we'll do. And he takes these young men and delivers them to the hand of the Gibeonites. And the 7 of his sons be delivered unto us, is what they said, and we will hang them up unto the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, I will give them. And the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. Now there's that other Mephibosheth I mentioned that had lame feet. This king spared him because he himself had made a covenant. An oath was between them, between Jonathan and David, Jonathan the son of Saul. But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah and the 5 sons of another woman that Michal had adopted and raised for their daddy, and brought them to the Gibeonites. And so we drop down in the middle of the story, and here they are. The king took those 7 men and turned them over to the hand of the Gibeonites, and the Bible said they did exactly what they said they wanted to do. They hung them up. Some researchers will tell you that they hung them up, but some researchers will tell you that they impaled them on those sticks, on those poles out of the ground. And they hung them up before the Lord, in the hill before the Lord. Now, something I want us to notice here, this was a vengeful story, a story of vengeance and revenge. And so our story today is about Rizpah, and she comes in, and she brought sackcloth. In reading about this, it wasn't just a covering that she sat on, but the sackcloth was basically like a tent. She set up residence, temporary residence out there in the wilderness or on the rock, from the beginning of harvest until the water dropped upon them out of heaven, and suffered neither the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beast of the field by night. She gave her life for those sons of hers. Alfred Lord Tennyson, an old poet, he wrote a poem one time called Rizpah, and his poem is about a Victorian era mother whose son was taken captured for petty theft, just some minor thing. But as a result of the lawyers, according to the poem, and the judge and others, they prosecuted him to the fullest extent of the law in excess of his crime. The punishment did not match the crime. They took him and jailed him and put him to death as a result of petty theft. And Tennyson's poem is about her going to the jailer and pleading for her son. His poem is about her going to the lawyers and cursing the lawyers. His poem is about her hearing his voice as she went to see him in the jail, and the jailer pushed her away and slammed the door. I forget the exact wording. I read it over it last night. If it's one of the, that kind of poetry, you have to get your mind set right in it and stay with it and follow it through to be able to really understand it. But in my own words, she went to the jail, and the jailer pushed her away. And as she's leaving the jail, she hears him call, "Mother," and she knew she could not go back. But the sound of him calling haunted her. It stayed with her beyond his death. When she took him his bones, and she talked about having a memory of the child growing inside of her and feeling him move in her womb. And here he is. He's dead now. He's gone. His crime was a petty crime. There was no mercy, only judgment, only wrath, only prosecution, only execution ultimately. And she talked about how she was trying to save the dignity of a good boy. He was a good boy, she said. He just caught up with the wrong crowd. And Tennyson doesn't lead you to believe that he was a bad boy and that his mama just believed him to be good. Most parents believe the best of their children. You know that? And so he wasn't leading you to think that she was wrong in her saying that he was a good boy. She said, "He's never lied to me." And there again, most parents don't think their kids lie. Just kind of let that sit there for a minute, But we've all been wrong about that. Every parent has been wrong about their kids. And it's not, you say, "Mine don't lie." I haven't seen one that didn't have to be taught. Don't you tell me something that's not true. One of my kids, bless his heart, I can't say too much about one of my kids because y'all won't take, 50% chance you're going to pick out which one it was. But he'd tell on himself, Bless his heart, his conscience was so tender. And he'd come in, just a little guy, he'd come in just to cry. And "I didn't tell you all the truth." I said, "Thank God for a working conscience," And then the other one, he was just sneaky. He didn't really, he didn't care. And thank God. Things could be so much worse, but thank God they're both saved now, living for the Lord, doing well. But every parent thinks their kid doesn't do anything wrong. But Tennyson doesn't lead us to believe that this kid was roughshod. But his story was, that the people he was with, he got caught up at the wrong time, at the wrong place. Truly, according to the poem, he did. And the time come, the mother saw what she thought was an innocent death. And she was a victim, just like Rizpah. Rizpah was a victim of vengeance. She was a victim of revenge. When you set out to get revenge, there are victims. There are innocent victims. I went back to an old book I've got. A guy named C. Roy Angell wrote several books, and he's a good writer. He's been dead many years. He wrote back in the 50s and 60s. He wrote Iron Shoes, Price Tags of Life, things like that, just essays and sermons. And he wrote a little sermon on Rizpah in his book, Iron Shoes. And I thought I remembered it. So yesterday just happened to have it there close by, and I reached and got it. And he got talking about a lady who was in the hospital, a doctor friend of his, and she was in the hospital, and just the prices that she gave tells you how old the story is. And she was laying up there getting ready for surgery, and she was in bad need of surgery, and it's a pretty dangerous procedure from what I could remember. And she said, the doctor come in and said, "How you feeling?" "Oh, I'm fine." She was happy as she could be going into surgery. He said, "It's pretty dangerous surgery. You really upbeat about this?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "I wanted a fur coat. It wasn't going to cost my husband but $600. And said he wouldn't do it. I said, "But guess what?" I said, "This operation is going to cost that old skin flint about $1,500. You know, the prices tells you how long ago that was of a surgery and a fur coat. But the point of the matter is, she was just tickled to death that old skin flint, that she had vengeance in her heart. She was willing to suffer because of that. You've heard people say it, or known of people saying it. Brother Archie Morgan used to tell about a fella. He said that man said, "I'll die and go to hell before I'll do so and so." Vengeance. Vengeance. And there's victims to that, aren't they? I'm telling you, this Rizpah, she was a victim of the vengeance of the Gibeonites. They didn't handle it right. David didn't handle it right. And when things are not handled in the right way, there are always innocent victims. Somewhere recently, and I can't remember if it was a sermon Brother Don preached or what, but somebody mentioned about how people had gone about some things and just handled it crass. Now, you can't just always use kid gloves. You hear me? You cannot just always use kid gloves. There comes a time that something's got to be done. And as respectfully and diplomatically and being as right as we possibly can, there's just, deal with it, whatever the issue may be, deal with it discreetly and try to make the best of a bad situation. But if you go in with a shotgun, somebody's going to get hit. One preacher said it's like using a chainsaw to fix a stopwatch or using a sledgehammer to fix a carburetor. I think we've seen a few we wanted to use a sledgehammer on. Just couldn't get them to work right, few opportunities, in the literal sense. But there's a better way to handle it than that. Solomon showed us that in his use of the sword. Now, I know Solomon was in his wisdom. You remember when they brought the baby before him and the women were arguing over whose baby was what? He taught us the futility of the sword. F.W. Borum wrote an article about the sword of Solomon, and he pointed out that Solomon taught us the futility of the sword. There's something we need to remember when we're handling situations. You may conquer a man with a sword, but you'll never win a man with a sword. And it's better to win a man than it is to conquer a man. Amen? And so when we get vengeance in our mind, the futility of the sword is like as I mentioned, like using a sledgehammer to fix a carburetor or a chainsaw to fix a stopwatch or whatever the case may be. There's a better way to handle it than that. A sword is a weapon of division, not a weapon of unification. It is a weapon of vengeance and not a weapon of healing. I dare say, looking at this woman, Rizpah, I dare say that, and really, C. Roy Angel talked about her being a little old lady. Other writers have talked about her being a younger woman, a beautiful woman, whatever. She was a concubine of Saul, but she was old enough that her sons were grown. And all indications were, and even our lesson writer pointed out, she had a maternal, loving relationship, a good relationship with those boys. That's important. But I dare say that till her dying day, she saw the visions of those blackening, decaying, bloody corpses hanging impaled upon those torture racks. She saw that. It stayed with her. She was a victim till her dying day of the vengeance. Did you know there are people in life today that will go to their grave shaking their head saying, I wish it could have been done differently. I wish it could have been handled differently. There's ministers today that have got over things that was done about them. And I look at the situation that happened, and they're still in the ministry, very, very successful in the ministry as pastors. And I think to myself, man, they are doing so good. I don't know if I could come back from that. I know by the help of God I could. They did. They didn't do anything wrong. They weren't guilty of anything, but they were accused of it. And as a result, they were, I hate to use the term, they were blackballed, put on a blacklist, but they just kept praying, and they kept being good to folks. And I know this is being videoed, and I'm not calling names here, but the man that I'm thinking of now, from what I remember, there come a time there was a business meeting at a church, and all of his accusers were there. And he went beforehand. He put a pan of water in the Sunday school room on the side, and he asked those accusers, said, I need to talk to y'all back here. Now, I don't know, just first impressions. I don't know what all happened, what all was said. But I was thinking, sleeves rolled up, we're gonna take care of this situation. But he did not carry a sword. He carried a pan of water. And he set those two accusers down, and he washed their feet. And I thought, what a man of God. Oh my, they had a sword, but he had a pan of water. Sometimes it might be best if you and I feel the Lord dealing with me right now. Sometimes it might be best if you and I, instead of carrying a sword, we just take a pan of water or banana pudding. Huh? Or a good offering. Or a gift certificate. You see what happened? David seen the light. He saw the light after the fact. It's a shame that Rizpah had to go through that. But according to our story, it was told King David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. Poor Rizpah, they said. Word leaked back to the throne, and David said, what's wrong with Rizpah? They said, you hadn't heard? She spread a sackcloth upon a rock and set up 5 months, day and night. She kept the jackals off at night, the howling beasts, the snarling. She kept them off of those corpses. During the daytime, whenever the vultures would come, did you know that buzzards eat human flesh just like they do a skunk or anything else? That's right. It's not just, we see them on the road. I hate them. Blow my horn. Get out of the way. Filthy buzzard, but they'll eat human flesh just like they will the flesh of a coyote or a dog. And then, during the daytime, Rizpah, waving her sackcloth or whatever, shooing them away from those bloody corpses, those decaying corpses, until David finally heard, and he said, you know what? Take that ordinance off the book that says anybody who's crucified can't stay on the cross longer than a day after they're dead. Take that ordinance off. They can't be buried in a king's tomb. Take that ordinance off. And he took those men down. And the Bible said he took the bones of Saul, who were in another place, and Jonathan, who were in another place, and the bones of the sons of Rizpah and of Michael, and buried them in the country of Benjamin in Zalon, the sepulchre of Kish, Saul's father. And those men performed all that the king commanded, and after the king was entreated or after that, God was entreated for the land. It's important this morning that we look at Rizpah's life and see the kind of victim that was made. When I first read Rizpah's story of her in the scripture, I saw a wild woman. Just first impressions, stay with you. I saw a wild woman, a crazy woman. You know, she's just making a spectacle of herself. But no, look deeper. I see a hurt woman. I see a woman who had wept until her eyes were dry. A woman whose heart was broken, figuratively speaking, in a million pieces, crushed. The loves of her lives. She was just a concubine to Saul. Chances are there was no love lost between them. Just a concubine. Just a mistress. Someone to have pleasure and have around. But these boys were the boys of her bosom. They were the children of her womb. They were the ones who had brought her joy. They were the ones who were the objects of her affections and her love. They were innocent. She was innocent. And now they were taken away because of father's sins. I was reading in that article yesterday, C. Roy Angel said there was a doctor close to Miami that called all the ministers back in the day, called all of the ministers into his hospital one day. He said, I want to have a meeting with all you guys. He called all the local ministers in. He said, what I'm about to show you is pretty gruesome. And he said, I want to warn you about that ahead of time. And so the lights went dim, and they began to see pictures of babies that had been born deformed, mentally retarded, physically deficient. And as the doctor was explaining to them what had happened and what was wrong with this child, he was careful to say that none of these kids lived over just a few days, some just a few weeks. After the film was finished, the lights came back up. The writer said that the doctor, in a very husky voice, broken feeling, broken sounding, he said, when I looked at all of these, this medical doctor said, I got one thing to say. Somewhere their mom and their dad sinned. Imagine that coming from a secular medical doctor. He said, Mama and Daddy done something wrong back down the line. Let me tell you something. There's victims to my attitude. There's victims to my motivation. There are victims to my ambitions. If all of those things are headed in the wrong direction for the wrong reason and using the wrong methods, somebody's going to be a victim. But I don't want to handle things with a sword. Give me a pan of water. You don't need to handle things with vengeance. You need to handle them with healing. Sometimes I've prayed, and I know Brother Mark has, and many of you have. We have prayed for situations, okay? Just a vague general term. Trouble in the church, trouble in family, trouble on the job, whatever it is. Issues come up. They happen to us all, okay? We're none exempt from these things. Let me just sum it up by saying the devil's doing his job. You hear me? And there's been times that I've prayed, and you have too. And maybe if you haven't, perhaps you should. Lord, I really feel like I'm right about this, but I'm willing to be wrong about it if I'm wrong. And sometimes I have to say, God, help me to know. Help me to know. Lord, give me some direction to know what I can do to make things better. It's mighty quiet here this morning. Maybe we ought to just, and I don't have a bone to pick here today at all, but sometimes I think it'd be good if we just all took a look and said, Lord, what can I do to make things better? What can I do to help fix this situation? What can I do to help heal this hurting heart? To bring back this wounded spirit? I don't know about you, but as a minister of the gospel, with the call of God on my life, I want to do everything I can to try to help somebody. I love what Brother Ralph Cox said, and he was a philosopher of all philosophers to me, a book collector too, and a great preacher. He used to say, and I've quoted it many times, you can shear a sheep close often, but you can only skin him one time. You can follow the advice of the Apostle Paul. Eventually, if things don't get better, you have to walk away. You have to turn folks, as Paul said, Hymenaeus was one of them, I forget the other one, but he said, I turned them over to Satan so they'd learn not to blaspheme. But I promise you that before he did that, every effort had been made to reconcile and to help somebody to get closer to God. You know what we're in a ministry of today at the house of God? We're in a ministry of healing and reconciliation. I believe in hellfire and brimstone, and I'm like our pastor. If you die without being right with God, you'll go to hell. But while you're living, we want to do everything we can to get you right and to keep you right with God. Isn't that right? Amen. Amen. May God bless you this morning. Brother Matt, it's time for me to sit down. I don't know if it's quite time for the folks to come out or not. I appreciate your indulgence, and I appreciate your attention. Let's do all we can to heal the hurt, to lift up the downcast. The Bible says, lift up the hands that hang down, strengthen the feeble knees. I love shouting with folks that shout. Sometimes we can do as much help just by crying with folks that cry. It's like the little girl that went over next door and playing with her neighbor, and she come home and she said and she crawled up in her daddy's lap. She said we were playing with Susie, I guess the girl's name was, and was playing with a doll, and the doll broke. The head came off, and one of the arms fell off. Her dad said, did you help her fix it? She said, no, but I helped her cry about it. If tears were ink this morning, some of you would be stained for life. And I can promise you that there's been some things that your pastor and your fellow church members, we haven't been able to do anything about them except we helped you cry about it. And sometimes that goes as far as anything. God bless you this morning. Let's love one another. Let's go to heaven together. Appreciate you.